Okay. So tonight's speaker is Professor Randall Boone. Randall is a professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability, and he's senior research scientist within the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. Randall's a wildlife ecologist, but his experience is diverse, including research in ecological modeling, spatial analyses, landscape ecology, biogeographical relationships, species-habitat relationships, coupled systems modeling, and wildlife and livestock mobility, reported in more than 75 publications and 20 book chapters. Randall's current research analyzes how landscape fragmentation can alter the numbers of livestock and wildlife that can be supported on an area. Also, global rangeland modeling, ways that deer are managed in the Northeast, and the food system of Colorado. He teaches courses in ecology and simulation, ecological and social systems. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Randall.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it. I'll continue the introduction in citing my humility, being in front of what are no doubt some expert birders. I count it as a hobby and recognize that I'm a rank amateur. And so it's really not that I don't know the species, I know all their names, but I know how to identify 30, and then everything else gets shoved into those 30. But that's the way it goes, I'm afraid. We'll keep working on it. Thank you for the invitation to come speak with you today. It is appreciated. Hopefully we'll be okay, see how it goes. I will set the stage on what we're speaking of today and talk of the prospects of climate change. I'll go into a bit of the physics associated with climate change just to kind of lay the foundation so that we're all on an even playing field. Talk about some of the changes that we've seen and what some futures might look like. And then about halfway through, I'll pivot to birds and focus more on avian responses. I don't mean to offend. This could potentially offend everyone in the room, but I will start by citing the difference between weather and climate. Again, I don't plan to offend anyone, but this goes back to, our legislatures alike going into Congress with snowballs on a cold day and saying there can't be climate change and such, not recognizing the difference between weather, which is a short-term response, and climate, which is usually classified or characterized using a 30-year mean. So when we want to talk about climate, folks will do an average of 30 years of data, for example, to characterize a response. Whereas weather is just day to day. I'll speak of some myths, and you'll see the name S. Denning in the corner. This is Dr. Scott Denning, who is recently or currently retiring from Colorado State, but an expert in scientific communication and in atmospheric science as well, but a really compelling guy. I'm a sad replacement, but he's also generous in providing information. So he shared with me some information I've been able to incorporate. And so we have these myths that climate is complicated. Now, certainly there are aspects that are. People get PhDs and such on the topic, but understanding why we have the issues that we have isn't particularly complicated. Another is that the concern about global warming comes about because of the changes in temperature that we've seen. You'll hear reports of the nine of the last 10 years being the warmest or the like. And that's evidence for the concern, but that's not why we're concerned. And lastly, that global warming is a theory based on complicated computer models. Those are certainly used to understand and project future conditions. But again, the theory has been around for many decades and is clearly defined. The first then, people are worried about climate change because it's getting warmer lately. That isn't correct, as we say. The idea is simpler than that. We have recognized for a long time, we, the global community, for a long time, that if you add energy to something, it warms up. And that's all we're talking about. And so as energy is added, things get warmer. And so really, fortunately, the arguments are fading quickly, which is a helpful thing. But back in the day, arguing over whether these patterns were real or not, it always kind of rang untrue, or at least unusual, because you're saying, well, you're really arguing whether something warms up when you add energy, and it simply happens. It's a physical response. It's not for anyone to say. Dr. John Tyndall in 1860s identified this response. And so the prospect of global warming has been recognized for 150 years. And so to me, that's really cool. We're talking about core principles, really a dynamic guy, lots of work done. But he was able to calculate that if you double the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, you'll add 4 watts of energy to every square meter of the earth every day. And if you do that, things get warmer. That's the nature of it. And so that's where we're starting. And then we'll flesh out this notion of doubling CO2 just a little bit. Of course, we're speaking of the global energy balance, which is started. I guess you have to start somewhere, although it's a cycle. We have incoming solar radiation. And that solar radiation is shortwave radiation. The sun's really hot, produces shortwave radiation that moves through the atmosphere without too much effect unless it's reflected by clouds or the like. And basically half of that energy is reflected back into space or has some other fate. The other half is absorbed by our Earth and warms our Earth. Later, that energy then is radiated from the Earth as long wave radiation. So a warm, cool body like that emanating long wave radiation. That's the heat that you'd feel in the desert as the sun sets, the radiation, and then the rapid cooling that we get in deserts. As that energy then leaves, we have greenhouse gases in our atmosphere that can absorb energy and store that energy, radiate that energy back, and essentially warm our atmosphere. And that's what we're talking about here. And so the idea then, of course, at the extreme, to paint the ugliest picture, we've got Mars to the left of us, which has a fraction of our atmosphere and huge cycles in temperature, just dramatic cycles. We need this greenhouse gas effect, this greenhouse warming. And then we have Venus on the other side, which has a very thick atmosphere and is hundreds of degrees. And so we're bracketed by some nasty conditions, and we live in a nice place. Now, when you think about what I come to when I'm pondering these questions is, why would one gas be a greenhouse gas and another isn't? What does it mean to be a greenhouse gas? Again, Denning is famous for answering this question in more compelling ways than me. But basically, as you know, we've got N2 as the dominant gas in our atmosphere, 78% or what have you. And another 19% perhaps is O2. And they absorb energy. They do indeed. There's no doubt that they're absorbing this infrared energy and then radiating it back out as well. But they're not very good at it. They only have the 2 atoms comprising the molecule. They've got the bonds. There's just not a lot of ways to vibrate there. They can spin, they could go like that, but there's not a lot going on there. And so they're not very good at absorbing energy and radiating it back again. These diatomic molecules you see. Compare that then, for example, with carbon dioxide, which has the 2 oxygen molecules and the carbon molecule, and it's more complex. It can bend and vibrate and rotate in different ways. So it can vibrate the oxygen molecules. They can move in and out relative to the carbon molecule. It can spin. And so that contributes to its ability to absorb more energy. And later, perhaps radiate that back out as the molecule reaches a lower state. Because of that, then, we have a greenhouse gas. Its ability to store that radiant heat is what comprises then that greenhouse gas. Water vapor is another example of a really good greenhouse gas. But again, one that we don't have particular control over. So it's the notion of being able to vibrate many ways to wiggle, many ways to spin, that comprise these greenhouse gases. People speak of several. CO2 we've talked about, methane is a big one, nitrous oxide is a big one. Chlorofluorocarbons, or F gases, are another. And people also speak about the warming potential for these different gases. And so what the world does then when they're talking about these things is say, well, let's set carbon at 1. Let's just call it a warming potential of 1 over a ton over a year, I think. And then, 100 years. And then you have this baseline, and that's related to two things then. One is its ability to store energy. And then the other is its longevity in the atmosphere. There are a few other things going on. Methane interacts with other elements and such, but those are the two main ideas there. And so CO2, for example, lasts for thousands of years in the atmosphere. Methane has a shorter lifespan, but it's much more reactive. And so we have a higher warming potential for methane, higher still for N2O, and then the F gases are really, really high. They're very good, but fortunately we've reduced use of those in recent times. In terms of evidence, it would be a challenge to describe all of the ways that people have looked at these things. It really, I love it. It reflects the creativity of people, really extraordinary creativity in devising different ways of tracking down past patterns and responses. This is just one example, but I think it's a pretty interesting one. The idea of using ice cores. And so people can go to the Greenland ice sheet, for example. There are snow events that get compressed over hundreds and thousands of years. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of layers that can be seen in these ice cores. So they drill ice cores, typically haul them to Boulder and other places, and they can then sample the bubbles in that ice. And that is a true sample of the ancient atmosphere at the time. Sample that bubble, so to speak, well, it's literally a bubble, measure its CO2 concentration, and you get pictures like this. So we end up with climate histories over 400,000 years. Just amazing activities that people do. And this is just one tiny example of amazing work that's done. You can see that it varies between 180 to 280 parts per million CO2 concentration. Prior to industrial times, we were at about 280 parts per million. Right now we're at 417, and it is increasing at a pretty rapid rate. It's not to be too overly dramatic, but if I gave this talk next year, I would need to update that number. It's climbing that quickly. So, of course, associated with our burning of fossil fuels. So we are mining carbon sources, burning those carbon sources, and returning to the atmosphere the carbon that had been locked away in deep fossil sources and such. What people do again is talk about the sources of variation and potential descriptions, or correlates perhaps, for this warming. People talk of volcanic eruptions, for example, and they do affect climate, but they typically cool. These large-scale eruptions cool the atmosphere rather than warm it. They put gases into the atmosphere that both interact, as I understand, but they basically shade and cool the atmosphere. People speak of variations in the incoming solar radiation, and there is some. There's a little bit of variation, but it's much smaller than would be able to describe the increases in temperature that we're seeing. And then the last includes human effects, our use of fossil fuels and other effects that get lumped in this figure. And this, I think back years and years ago of Al Gore on a lifting device, Inconvenient Truth, that's what I'm looking for. And he was on a man lift, and as he was showing the pathway of CO2 concentration and warming, he had to rise up on this man lift to make the point. Very dramatic. These are projected changes. Many examples of this, of course, and there are many teams making these projections, so they do vary. But these are general responses. We've got warmer temperatures on land versus ocean. The ocean absorbs quite a bit of heat. We've got warmer temperatures in the Arctic than we have in other parts of the world, associated with the loss of sea ice and the change in the albedo. Ice reflects all the light, and then when it melts, the dark ocean water absorbs energy. You see a mean global temperature of 2 to 5 degrees C. Depends, on projections, but 5 degrees C may take us out to about 2080 if things go really poorly. That's not a very happy story for what humanity would do regarding warming. 3 to 6 degrees in North America, you could see 5 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Lots of implications for this, of course. Got questions about rainfall. The world's pretty good in general at estimating temperature changes. Precipitation is much more variable. They're still good at it, mind you, but it's much more variable. The unknowns, the errors associated with their predictions are much larger. But some areas are expected to get wetter, some to get drier, and the change in the timing of rainfall during the year, or precipitation in general, is projected to change as well. Concerns for agriculture, water use. In northern Colorado, we're projected to get more rainfall incrementally, but we're also projected to use more water to grow plants because of increased temperatures. And the increased evaporation and transpiration, as it's called, will increase and ultimately effectively yield less water for plants because of the increased evaporation. Water supplies, ski industry, challenges there that they're pondering as well, mass migrations and such. You might consider what this difference means. And again, a resource from Scott Denning. The notion that the climate in Denver would be akin to the climate in Amarillo, Texas, if that gives you a sense of what we're talking about. The same for Grand Junction going to Tucson, which is a little extreme for me, and Illinois to Mississippi. Here's a summary of both the sources of greenhouse gases and the sectors from where they're produced. And so you can see fossil fuel use, carbon dioxide is the dominant source of these gases. Other sources are in a red color there. Over on the left, you see deforestation, the decay of biomass. That's the decomposition of biomass and release of that carbon back into the atmosphere. Methane, nitrous oxide, and F gases, On the right are the sectors from where that comes. It's pretty evenly distributed. You can see again, the energy supply is a big piece, transport as well, industry. Agriculture includes, for example, the methane released by ruminants. And so cow burps, if it helps you. So it's a pretty big component of the contribution of agriculture. And people, of course, in CSU and other places are working to minimize that effect. Now, unfortunately, another misunderstanding, I wouldn't call it a myth, is that if we reduce emissions, things will get better straight away. Unfortunately, that is not the case. We as all of humanity, or at least those in developed areas, have put ourselves onto a path that won't get better quickly. And that's because of the longevity of CO2 in our atmosphere. What happens is it has to, now people are working on engineering solutions. I work with a colleague who's working on an engineering solution to, well, we'll hold off on what they're doing, but it's pretty cool. We can talk about it. But those solutions aside, where you physically pull out CO2 from the atmosphere, we're basically waiting for CO2 to be absorbed by the ocean and then locked away in rocks. But that is a slow process because there's a lot of water in the oceans. It's layered because of different temperatures of the water, and it doesn't mix very quickly. And so there's a thin layer of water that is exposed to the atmosphere, and it changes really slowly. And so this process takes a long time. That doesn't mean we shouldn't change our ways, right? In terms of emissions and such. But it means to me, what it says to me is that, and to many others, is that we focus on both sides of the coin. We work on emissions, work to reduce those, try to get on the right side of our future histories, if that is a phrase. But we also work on adaptations, mitigations. So we're doing the mitigation, but also how to adapt to what will be a changed world. We have changes like this. This is a formal map up to 2015 of changes in temperature, and these are an anomaly. I'll introduce it really. This is my effort to introduce an anomaly. I'm going to take this to finer and finer scales, and it's a difference. So we take that 30-year mean that I spoke of, and then plot out the difference away from that mean, and call it an anomaly. So it could be warmer than the average, it could be cooler than the average. But you can see an increase in time in temperatures and the anomalies in temperature for the globe. We can zoom into the Northern Hemisphere. And this is a different perspective of the same idea. So again, these are temperature anomalies, and they are for a whole region. So think of little pixels comprising an image, and you take all those pixel values, plot them out, and you end up with a normal distribution, this bell-shaped curve. And you can see the movement of that bell-shaped curve through the decades as conditions warm. Global pattern of warming, again, warmer in the Arctic, warmer over land. You can see some really warm periods. 2012 was warm, 2014, other periods since. Now this is a different perspective, just touching our feet into a perspective on avian responses. One of the more impressive efforts in this regard is the effort from Audubon, not to seek favor too strongly, but their report is extraordinary. And I'm actually going to cite it in two separate ways. I'll connect it when appropriate. But here we have survival by degrees a recent report from Audubon, very thorough analyses. And this is, again, climate change responses of birds reported on in survival by degrees. And this is for Colorado. So we've now zoomed into Colorado and the potential responses of birds. Now they have the birds, we'll deal with the birds at a later time, the two columns on the right. In the middle is an area estimate of what will be affected. And so the dominant responses here are extreme spring heat. That's a concern. And then fire responses is another concern. And then we zoom into Fort Collins. Now, this is a representation of Fort Collins that I've worked up that shows every day since 1900. And so the days are vertical, the years are horizontal, and it is an anomaly from the minimum temperature. So, you know, there's maximum temperature during the day, minimum temperature during the day. You can look at the minimum temperature and say, well, was it warmer than average or was it cooler than average? If it's really warm compared to average, let's paint it red. If it's really cool compared to average, let's paint it blue. And to my eye, there's a whole lot going on here, mainly an increase in red as you move to the right. I had this picture in my mind for a long time, and then I just started in December looking at it. And then I thought, well, that should be a real thing, so I'm making it. And I have a very patient wife. We have 73,000 little cardboard painted chips scattered all over our house. And I'll get it put together, but it's been something. I've really enjoyed it in a weird way. General responses then, some that we've talked about. We've got mean temperature increasing through time. Sea level rise, you've heard of that, of course. The prospect of both melting of large ice masses. So we've got the Greenland ice sheet, we've got the Antarctic ice sheet melting and contributing water to the oceans. There's also a component which is really kind of important early on in this process of expansion of the seawater itself. And so we think of water as almost uncompressible, but there is so much water in the ocean that even its tiny bit of expansion with the warming that it's doing causes a sea level rise. Changes in snow cover, we'll talk of that. This is a pattern of sea ice retreat. And so you can see the long-term pattern with the yellow line and a decline as you move forward, a graphic put together by Duncan, and pretty dramatic changes. A real decline in Arctic sea ice. This has caught everyone's attention, of course. Again, changes in the what's called the albedo, the reflectivity of that region, how much light it reflects back. Also, for example, the interest of militaries, because there's now Northwest Passage. You don't have to have the Nautilus submarine to go across the top of the world. You could just take a surface ship at certain times of the year, and it's really caused them to rewrite some of their defense plans and such. And so we see this general decline in September sea ice over time. Glacial retreats is another example. You've no doubt heard of that as well. This happens to be in New Zealand, but you could find retreating glaciers all over the world. There are some that are expanding, which is pretty interesting, but most are in retreat, associated with warmer temperatures. And so Fox Glacier shrinking over time, as Dr. Fuller has visited them over and over and taken pictures. snow cover has changed. And so we're really closely associated with this in Fort Collins. Of course, the news reports and such that talk of the snow accumulation, but the timing of the events have changed. We have experts in our department in this topic, and I'm an amateur, but the notion that there's more rapid melt of the snow. So we have what used to be snow melt that would extend into the summer or late spring now happens in quite a short time. And so we have rapid melt and filling of the pooter and such, and then reduced flows after that. Lots of implications for dam construction and fish production and all the rest. Implications for fire. A strong relationship between warming in a region and the frequency of fires, the size of fires. And so that's quite well established. And start to bring in some avian responses here, but here we have mountain pine beetle, which is a native species. It's always here. It's an eruptive species, this pine beetle. And of course, the trees are dead now, and so we don't talk about it so much. But 10 years ago, of course, we had hill slopes that were all red with dead trees. And what we're talking about here is a response to climate change. And so the mountain pine beetle overwinter under the bark of trees, and traditionally, or typically rather, they would be killed off by typically brief but very cold periods. And that would limit their populations. That doesn't happen so much anymore, and we have this eruption of pine beetles. That has telegraphed through the system, as many of these effects would. So the notion of viewing the ecology of these systems as an ecosystem, as a connected system of feedbacks. But here I'll just cite it once, this notion of increases in pine beetles causing the shifts in ranges and abundances of forest birds. So Masha looked at the abundance of 39 birds, and 2/3 of them were affected by the eruption of pine beetle. And so we have this connection between climate change and the dynamics of forest birds. Now, a big response is a change in phenology. You may know phenology being the timing of biological events. And so this is of great interest to people, in part because it's great for citizen science. People can take repeated pictures of an area and quantify changes in phenology. They can quantify how green up changes through time, or how peak biomass occurs, although that's harder, or when things brown down or what have you. And that's phenology. This is certainly most relevant for birds in the context of climate change. This is where people go, is the changes in phenology and in the ranges of species in association with these changing events. So we've got things like the phenology network, ways to characterize these things. And in general, what we're speaking of is range shifts of organisms. In response to a warming climate in the northern hemisphere, the opposite in the south, in response to a warming climate, these birds are moving toward the north. Now, in turn, they could also move toward higher elevation, depending upon their ecology. And so there's something called a lapse rate, where you move up 1,000 meters and it's 6 degrees cool. That's kind of a predictable pattern, 6 degrees C cool. And so there's the potential then for these birds to move to higher elevation as well to offset the warming that they're experiencing. This is perhaps an aside, but how we know these things, all the wonderful work people do to contribute to these databases that scientists can use and others as well to address these questions. We spoke early on of eBird, for example, the Cornell resource. It's now an extraordinary effort. We've got nest records, recordings in, well, other parts of the world as well, but certainly North America. North American Breeding Bird Survey, a really regular survey that perhaps some of you have participated in. Secondary roads get surveyed each year in a regular way. Breeding bird atlases, Christmas bird counts, radar ornithology is a fun one. This is using the Doppler radar that you see on the news that's used to forecast weather. And that radar can spot collections of birds. Well, collections of anything. People have used it to quantify locusts and such, but for birds, you can see them disperse out from their, some species, disperse out from their roosts in the morning and then come back together at night, and you see it as circles on the radar. In terms of phenology, then again, that's a dominant change that we see, and in part because it's something that we can quantify. So here's an early example, and an expert in the field, Parmesan, has looked at this issue for a long time. Here's the arrival of swallows and their nesting in a region, and it's 9 days earlier than 40 years ago. Again, and we're reaching back here. This was early work. And so quite an impressive finding, correlated with May temperature. So the warmer the May was, the earlier that the animals would nest. We speak of it as advancing their period of laying eggs, for example. It's an odd word, but advancing means to back up, go figure. Now, again, Audubon has a wonderful resource for this. If you'd like to read more about it, I'm going to do this once more, so don't give up on me, but it's an extraordinary resource here of all the species and fates of species under different warming conditions, under different periods of climate change. And so if you're curious about the potential response of a given species, I do invite you to check it out. Here's an example for ruffed grouse, and again, a shift toward the north as these species that are highly mobile shift toward areas they would find more suitable for them. So we have climate change influencing phenology. That includes the timing of migration, laying date, the duration of the breeding season. This is a big one. Breeding seasons are getting longer, but it's a more complex story than that, of course. There's changes in brooding patterns and what have you. An ugly term, but I'll toss it out there, phenological disjunction. All they're talking about there is a disagreement between organisms. Let me take a non-bird example, but the classic example in this notion is yuccas. They are obligate pollinators with yucca moths. So they need to be pollinated by yucca moths. The plant provides food for the moth pollinates the plant, everybody's happy. But you can imagine if there's a difference in their shift in response to climate change. If a plant starts flowering earlier before the moth is there, that's a disjoint that could be bad for everybody involved. That's what we're talking about in this case. Although I'll give another example that's really wild, interesting to me. So here we have laying dates. Here's work by Dunn and Muller. They've got laying dates that have advanced. Clutch size has changed for populations as well, which is interesting, larger clutches. Multiple broods per year is an issue. So there have even been cases of birds nesting later in the season. But when they take a deeper dive, from what I understand, those are often birds that would normally nest twice, come off with two broods, have switched to only have one. And so it's a later pattern, but there's a reason for it, so to speak. Non-agricultural breeds, herbivores and predators, those that have more flexibility in responding to resources where they're moving to. Insectivores don't have that flexibility. The insects aren't there yet necessarily, and so they're not showing the same response. They're advancing more than others. We've got to advance in 0.16 days per year in laying. So every decade, it's a day and a half earlier. Here's the example I mentioned. Inouye and others did this work. Looking at American robins in the Rocky Mountains. And interesting to me, so we're talking about a disjoint again between melting patterns of snow down low and up high. And so the robins are getting the signal at low elevations that they should migrate, and they're migrating uphill, so to speak. And so they're getting the signal to migrate earlier. Whereas at the high elevation where they're migrating to, the period of ice, of snow melt hasn't changed much. There's no relationship in the left-hand graph. And so what's happened is the birds are arriving earlier and the snow is still there. From what I can gather, they arrived 4 days early typically in the past, and then the snow melted away on average. Now they're arriving 18 days early, waiting for that period for the snow to melt. Responses include, so what determines whether a species is apt to respond to climate change includes just the lack of adaptability, whether a species is able to adapt to this pattern or not. Dispersal ability. Of course, we have different bird species with different dispersal abilities. Most are good flyers, so they can get where they need to be. That's why we use them as an indicator. But there are others that can't. Specialization, this is a big one. Basically, the species that are specialists are more at risk than those that are generalists. And so if you think of an American crow, it's going to be okay in terms of its response to climate change. It can, well, you know how it goes. It can handle carrion, it can handle seeds, it can handle a hamburger in the parking lot of the McDonald's. If we're talking about a crossbill, that's a specialist that will have more difficulty responding to changing patterns. Small population size in general can increase the risk of extinction for a species. Sensitivity to extreme events. I may be reading too much into this, but I think, for example, you know, the dramatic stories people tell of hummingbirds using 1/3 of their energy supplies in a cold night, things like that. We are anticipating more extreme responses in climate. There'll be more droughts, there'll be more floods, there'll be more weather events. And so it could be harder on those species. Declines in quality, and then biotic effects, increasing or new competition taking place. Species that have never experienced each other. So for example, here's an example for invasive species. So we can anticipate invasive species shifting their ranges as well and changing the balance within a community as the native species have to now compete with this invasive species, whatever it may be. Now, I'm going to go back to Bateman. I happened to find this before I found the Audubon work. And I ultimately saw that they're the same thing. This is the published version. This is kind of the journal version of the Audubon report. And so they overlap a great deal. But they cite that birds are effective indicators for other less mobile species. And so this is the idea that we're apt to see changes in birds before we'd see something else because they are so mobile. And of course, people like to watch them. People like to count them and mark them, keep lifeless and such. And so that's another reason for their utility being indicators. Now, the logic of these reports, and most of what I'll tell you from here on out, is related to changes in range area. Generally in ecology, we have a strong relationship, a lot of variability, but a strong relationship between the geographic range of a species and its population size. And so when people talk of shrinking ranges, it's putting a species more at risk. And that's how they're talking about it in this context. So when they speak of species that are more vulnerable or less vulnerable, they're talking about changes in its range. Again, you can argue with it, and some would, but that's the logic that's applied. They looked at 604 North American birds, big effort, huge effort. And what they're doing is it's called niche envelope modeling. I've done some of it. There's a few ways to do it, but basically they're taking the current distribution of the species in question, a single species, and saying, let's use a bunch of computer surfaces, GIS layers, computer spatial data, and relate the occurrence of that bird to these layers, including climate layers. So what's the weather now, or in the last 10 years, or what have you? And we're going to predict the distribution of that species based on all those surfaces. Then they take out the current weather and put in future weather. So lots of teams all over the world are predicting surfaces for what it'll look like in 2070 or the like. They take out the current, they put in the new, the future, and say how will range change in response to the global change that we're talking about. They did that for all the species there. 2/3 of them were assessed to be moderately or highly sensitive, vulnerable to climate change, if there was an increase of 3 degrees. Now, the Paris Accord and such is hoping to cap increase to 1.5 degrees, but who knows how it'll go. We may reach 3 degrees ultimately. Now, as you might guess, if conditions are better, if we are able to cap warming to 1.5 degrees, then the birds are better off. Of those 2/3 of species that were at risk, 76% of those were reduced in vulnerability, and 38% were not vulnerable at all. And so there's certainly an interest in countless regards, including reduction of human misery and a lot of other ways in maintaining that warming below 1.5 degrees. And we are, as I say, it's a little less than 1 to a little over 1 degree, depending upon who you talk to. Now, this is one of the main figures that is published with that report. I'm going to zoom in on pieces of it. It's a little hard to read here, but you get a sense of where we're going. It is vulnerability. The red bars are bad, the blue bars are good, and we've got colors in between, right? So let's zoom in. We've got our most vulnerable groups are the Arctic species, lots of warming in that area, the boreal species, western forest, and water birds. Whoops. Moderate species include the grassland species, eastern forest, the neotropical migrants and such, coastal species. And then we have the least vulnerable of these. Those include airline species, as you might guess. They're living in pretty brutal places right now. They're adapted to those conditions. Marshlands, the urban species, again, as you might guess, a whole bunch of generalist species with amenable to development. And then the generalists more generally, with an unfortunate choice of words. They also mapped out these distributions and mapped out changes, net changes in the richness, the species richness, the number of species in an area. Now, what we're seeing then are really big changes in community composition. That's not quite what's represented here. Here is a change in the number of species. So you can see large areas in northern or central Canada that have a decrease in the number of bird species. But then to the north, they've got increases in the number of bird species. And this is also describing changes in the communities where species that obviously were farther south at one point are now present, and not so much, others would have moved north. And so in general, in these reports, again, as an amateur reading these, I took the message, the punchline that we see a lot of these changes through time. The shifts in communities, changes in species richness, the number of species. But in terms of extinctions or really big dramatic changes, they say those are much rarer. And so we're talking about changes in what we see rather than the silent spring, so to speak. Now, I had problems with this approach. This is an aside. I'm going to share my dip into these questions, even though it's a bit technical and geeky, but that's what I do. When people do these extrapolations of, they take out the climate for current and they put the new climate in, and then run their models to say this is where its new range will be, it doesn't include any biotic interactions. So there's no competition included. I ran a project that looked at that and the potential for including this kind of competition between birds. And it involved the same kind of information, the same kinds of models were made. Not exactly the same, but here you see, it's called a regression tree. It takes a landscape and says, we'll take everything, let's take everything above 8 degrees, say, for American robin, and move it to one side of the tree, and then everything below 8 degrees for the robin and move it to the other side. Then it splits the landscape finer and finer and finer until you're able to create a map of American robin abundance. Do that for a couple hundred species, as we did in the project. And then I set up a method of representing a competition, really an evolutionary approach, where individuals on the landscape would compete to occupy a given area. So a given little patch of land, the structure of the trees wouldn't change, but the values in the trees could change by tiny amounts. And so what I was asking there really was, how plastic were their species habitat associations? How much could they change? Because we know that they can to some degree. We've got these relationships that allow us to map the occurrence of species, but when there's a new organism there that they have to respond to, they can change their conditions and their habitat selection, what they favor. And so the machine did this competition and determined who would occupy which area. And for each of the species, we came up with maps that show the distribution using traditional methods, and then the distribution incorporating competition. So an interesting effort, a little bit hazy on some of the methods, but still an intriguing effort. Now, again, I have looked at resources that were available and again, stumbled upon Audubon. It is an extraordinary effort. And so there is a web page that speaks of how climate change will affect Colorado birds. And an amazing resource. There's a sheet of all the different species that are laid out. Those are for national responses, and then notes in regard to Colorado. And differences in warming potentials. So does humanity tell a nice story and what will be the effect on birds? Is it a poor story, and what would be the effect? Different time periods. And then a particular report, the survey by degrees summarized for Colorado, is available as well. So resources, if you'd like to read more about this, there are some resources available. So, summary, climate change has been recognized for a long time. And so this is not a new phenomenon. This is the playing out of things that were predicted 130 years ago. Environmental changes are numerous. It's really all but trivial now to talk about evidence for climate change. There's an extraordinary amount. The farther north you go, the more you get people all over the world having to respond to these issues. I work with pastoral people in East Africa, and they are dealing with more frequent drought now. Changes in phenology for birds are most evident. Spring timing is changing the most, but fall has more modest changes. Numerous geographic distributions will shift, communities will change, but rates of extinction and other large-scale changes are less frequent. Well, I appreciate your time. I hope that's the kind of thing you were looking for. And any questions, I'm happy to do my best.
So what we're going to do, first of all, is I'll take a minute. So we've left, that was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. We've left plenty of time for questions. And what I would invite people who are attending by Zoom to do is to type your questions into the chat window, and we will relay them to our speaker. Here at the Senior Center, you can raise your hand if you have a question. What we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions in the room and see if there are questions from Zoom. But I'm going to ask you when we get questions from Zoom to repeat them before you answer.
I'll do my best.
As well as in the room.
All right.
Not sure if the microphone will pick up what people say here in the room.
All right. I'll do my best to do that. We'll see how many I don't knows I can build up before we give up the ghost. Again, if you'd like to know about pastoral livestock and wildlife, I'm your guy. Zebu cattle in Kenya. Yeah.
Well, I was, when you gave the comparisons of Denver could be getting Amarillo, Texas weather. What about poor Amarillo? What are they gonna?
It is true. So the notion of Denver gaining Amarillo's climate, how will Amarillo fare? And it is sufficiently scary, it's true. One of the, so I could take that as a comment, but as a professor, I won't. I'll still give a 50-minute speech about that. I should, but anyway. One of the resources that's produced is called World Climate. They have, again, these surfaces that show climate in 2050, 2070 from all the different teams around the world. And so you can just download those. And there's a student working on trees. You got her name? Natalie. Working on trees in Fort Collins. And one of the things she's doing, for example, is saying, what trees should be planted in Fort Collins? And to do that, she's looking at the climate of a band of cities down in the southern part of the US and what their climate, I probably flipped that around. It would be our climate in 2070 and what the equivalent climate is currently down south. And I can imagine doing the same for Amarillo, and it would be a sad story, I'm sure. So there are resources to actually quantify that, but I haven't done so, of course. But sufficiently scary that I'll stay in Fort Collins, I think. Other questions? Sure.
So you said the modeling has all these different GIS layers
Yes.
that it uses to figure out the range of birds and then does the future projection. Could you talk about what some of those layers are? Like, does it include food and water? And
No,
shelter and-
typically not. It
Repeat
is,
the question.
in fact, almost certainly not. It's
Repeat
at
the
a
question.
broader, oh, thank you. That's how long I remember. John asked, what kinds of layers are included in what we speak of as niche envelope modeling, this computer modeling of current and future distributions? It's a GIS exercise. It's at a broader scale than that. And so we wouldn't necessarily know those resources across a region. And so what people have used, I've used it as well, are elevation, although that's secondary. I don't think of animals typically saying, I know I'm at this elevation. Slope, things like that, sometimes land cover type, sometimes soil type. But then the big one is this collection of data that people have developed that, you know, some data sets catch people's imaginations or just are really helpful as a resource. And this data set, it's called BioClimate. It's a lot of clever people getting together to create 19 layers that summarize responses that animals and plants might care about. And so it is just climate, but it includes these 19 things that might sound a little strange, but things like temperature, mean precipitation, but also the wettest month of the summer, the driest month of the winter, heat accumulation, things that animals typically care about. And so step one in this work is to download BioClimate and to use it. And then they have equivalent surfaces for future conditions. It'd be wonderful if we had those resources. Boy, now I'm sure someone has done that work at fine spatial scales, but again, to know nesting sites and food availability would involve a lot of field work, presumably. Other questions? Anything on the chat?
Not right now, but I do want to point out we have a few participants from Aiken Audubon and from Mesa Verde, so we've got folks from all over.
Oh, wonderful. I like Mesa Verde. Very nice. I may have stumped him, John.
Right. So I'll ask another one.
All right.
Could you clarify, you had a slide that showed a reduction in vulnerability if future warming is 1.5 degrees rather than 3 degrees. But it seemed like there's kind of two different numbers in that slide. And I'm just wondering, I guess what I'm really getting at, you can answer this any way you want, is the actions we're taking to mitigate emissions are going to determine whether we're at 1.5 or 3 or an even higher number 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now. So could you explain again on that last point how much of a difference there is between in vulnerability between 1.5 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming?
When I read through the work, I took it to mean, because they speak of the group in the first set. So what I took it to mean is straight away we have 2/3 of the species as vulnerable at 3 degrees. Now that leaves I think the reason they chose this logic, if I read it correctly, is that there's a third that's not vulnerable. And so there's no more need to address them, if you will. So they get set aside, and then we focus on the 2/3. Of those 2/3, 3/4 of them were reduced in vulnerability, and 38% shifted to non-vulnerable. So that's the logic, but in general, just a lot fewer challenges with that reduced temperature, just less shifting and everything. And so people are speaking of maybe we'll get to, if things don't go well, we'll get to, I shouldn't cite because I don't remember, but 2 degrees, 2030. I've read of 2.5, 3 by 2080. So I'm not sure. I probably got those numbers wrong, but let's work to avoid it if we can.
What the risk of doing math in my head, it seems like you're saying, or you're reading that to say maybe half of the species assessed, or hundreds of bird species, they're going to be more vulnerable if we go from 1.5 degrees to 3.
Yes, absolutely.
So I guess the way I interpret that is we may or may not be able to hit that 1.5 degree target, but we have to keep working to not get to 3.
I agree, absolutely. And this is, of course, just one lens into that issue for the Collins Audubon Society, but for folks in poverty around the world and the pastoralists that I sometimes work with and 100 other examples. There's just a lot of challenges for those that have less adaptability than many Americans do. And so there would be a lot that would improve if we're able to avoid those extreme temperatures. And again, that's what's brought about the Paris Accord. It's a central finding or agreement of that accord, and the changes the administration is making now to try to limit gases and increase production. But the changes that are needed to offset emissions are certainly non-trivial. They're, every little bit helps, there's no doubt, but ultimately we're talking about large changes, areas the size of India put to biofuel, for example, if that was an effort. 20,000 square kilometers of solar cells is what I've read to help out in that regard. The replacement of coal-fired plants, 1,400 plants getting shifted to natural gas production offsets a gigaton of carbon, which is 1/10 of our use. So big changes are needed, but we can do it. We can do it easily. And in fact, it's not only a matter of doing it. There's a whole lot of money, a whole lot of opportunity that presents itself in moving toward this green economy. We can take advantage of that. Again, I'll cite and credit Scott Denning, but he speaks of, it was inspirational to me. He speaks of the person, typically a student in the room, being the king of the world in 1800 and saying, you run everything, you get to decide. And someone comes to you and says, what I have is a proposal to dig up the equivalent of 10 gigatons of carbon every year. I'd like to wire up almost all the houses in the world. I'd like to produce millions of cars every year, hundreds of thousands of miles of roads every year. I would like to do all these things. And of course, you'd laugh them out of the room, but you've guessed the punchline. We've done that. It just happened. It's where we are now. And it was part of development. It kind of came naturally and people got rich off of it and all the rest. People fed their families doing the job. We need to do it again, just in a different direction that produces less carbon. Wow. I'm supposed to talk about birds and here I am on a soapbox.
That's a good question.
Notes and thanks coming in.
Okay. I have to make one more announcement before we wrap
Ah.
up.
Well, thanks, folks. I appreciate your time.
That was very good.
Thank